if you look into history, anthropology, you find that markets are not universal forms. Markets are constructed because, first of all, if you're going to trade in a market with money, you have to, strangely enough, have money. Money requires a unit of account, a pound or a dollar or something. Money originally, well before you had market economies like we have, was there as recording debts and tributes that the non-government sector, if you're going to use that phrase, like people in ancient Egypt, would be paying to the pharaoh and his entourage, etc. So markets follow from the state. And we can see that nowadays because when you have a dysfunctional state, the markets don't work in those economies.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. If this is your first time hearing about MMT, you might want to listen to our first 3 episodes for an introduction, which I've linked to in the show notes, along with some other things that relate to this particular episode. Just wanted to jump in here to tell you that Modern Money Lab are running a series of free online lectures throughout January and February featuring John T. Harvey, Yeva Nassisian, Ndongo Sambasila, Daniel Koza and Fred Block. I'm sure long-time listeners will be familiar with most of those names and won't want to miss out, so there's a link in the show notes to where you can get registered for those lectures, along with links to some other things that you might find helpful for following the conversation in this particular episode. You can support this podcast financially via patreon.com/MMT podcast for as little as $1 a month or £1 a month, or whatever the equivalent is wherever you live. And supporting the show in other ways, whether it's by recommending us to other people or just by listening and spreading the word about this stuff, really helps too. So thanks, as ever, for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive in. Number 7 of the fishy financial fictions is the market. I'm going to throw that in there. And that's the idea that markets are natural and benevolent and they tend towards equilibrium. And it's so deeply seated, it's not even talked about because, as the saying goes, fish discover water last. People naturally buy and sell stuff. We'll do it several times today and we'll all be doing it every day for the rest of our lives. And it's a good thing. People put things up for sale. If those things are rubbish, they won't sell. That's a market signal to stop making rubbish. And when people make good things, those things fly off the shelves and the market matches supply with demand perfectly. And if everybody just acts really selfishly, which fortunately is our nature, good things will happen, but only if we let the market tell us what's good and what's bad, because it's wiser than all of us. Phil, how could anybody be against that?
Well, I mean, there are sort of 2 parts of that. It's like, is the market a natural form, like a volcano? And then secondly, relatedly, does it always deliver the best outcomes, i.e. always, sometimes, or never? Well, on the first one, I mean, there's Ivan Invanitsi, who I'll shout out to. He uses a great phrase. The market is an epiphenomenon of the state. In other words, the state comes first. And if you look into history, anthropology, all of the sociology, all of these actual attempts to analyze things, you find that markets are not universal forms. Markets are constructed. And markets are quite complicated if you think about it, because first of all, if you're going to trade in a market with money, you have to, strangely enough, have money. But then again, money requires a unit of account, a pound or a dollar or something. Well, the state has to introduce. It can't spring up. And there's a guy called Jeffrey Ingham, who's a sociologist really, but an expert, talks about that. And if you look, Randy Ray's done a lot of work, you find going into the ancient stuff that money originally, well before you had market economies like we have, was there as recording debts and tributes that the non-government sector, if you're going to use that phrase, like people in ancient Egypt would be paying to, the pharaoh and his entourage, etc. So markets are follow from the state, and we can see that nowadays because when you have a dysfunctional state, the markets don't work in those economies. So you look around the world, you've got a lot of war and an unstable state. The markets don't work. Your markets can't work if all the banks have been blown up or there is no roads. So if you think about that, markets are not a natural form. They are a development. And Karl Polanyi wrote about this. If your listeners are interested in reading about that, it's a very interesting subject. So you've got the state, or a massive, doesn't have to be the state, usually is, it could be some leading stakeholder, to use a fancy term, and there'll be a level of inequality, you'll have a unit of account, development of the taxation system, if you like, the MMT money story. Then you have to decide, well, okay, going back to your point, people buy and sell things, and is this good or bad? Well, I say in generally, it's good. You might have a good idea. You might, borrow some money from a bank, and you might produce something and employ people. It's flexible. You got a load of very complex regulations. You go out and buy things and sell things, employ people, and the economy grows with a government that's watching over what's going on and protecting what I'm going to call the public good. So in other words, stopping these firms polluting things and destroying the environment for future generations, stopping firms from exploiting workers, stopping firms from illegal business practices. So the idea that this enlightened self-interest, or whatever you call it, always leads to the best is patently not the case. So I go back to this, the market is a good servant, but a poor master. So I think we do need a market system. But I think the argument should be to operate a business where you can make profit, employ people, is a privilege. And you have to pass, if you like, the test in lieu of serving public purpose. And that's fine. So that's my view of markets.
I completely agree. I think first of all you have to accept that the markets are not natural and that they need regulation, and then I think we need a new way of regulating markets. I heard Rohan Gray a while back, very long time ago. He said something that stuck in my head, and that was it's better to tell the banks. This was in the context of the financial sector. He said it's better to tell the banks what they can do as opposed to what they cannot do.
I think that comes from Warren's proposals, actually.
Yeah, okay. The first time I heard it was from Rohan. And,
I see. Yeah.
And that completely made sense to me. And I think we could apply that to a lot of the things the market is doing. To just, before we go down certain routes that they need to seek approval in order to expand operations to a new area, and they have to persuade us that new areas are worth expanding into and are, actually socially beneficial. I would much rather that approach rather than say than this approach that we have at the moment, where we simply accept that the market knows best, and therefore the market should decide for us what is good for us, and that profit is the ultimate decider of value. Of what's socially necessary.
We should also emphasize, as heterodox economics people, this idea that you have in your head, which is kind of on the face of it okay, that a market involves sellers and buyers or bidders, and eventually an equilibrium price is reached for any given good or service, between the tension between those two parties. And therefore, you then take this leap going, okay, so markets inherently tend towards equilibrium. But obviously, I'm sure one of you will perhaps jump in with the counter argument that actually, no, markets don't inherently tend towards equilibrium. And that's a big problem. We've experienced it in 2008 and, many times before.
Markets tend towards collapse, if not.
But the point is, it's not an exogenous, i.e. it doesn't come from outside the system and impact the market, which would ordinarily be tending towards equilibrium.
Yeah.
It's that it's generating instability from within itself. The instability is endogenous, to sound clever about it.
Yes.
You've been paying attention on that Money Lab course, Christian. Equilibrium is an issue, sorry if I'm, in the sense that you have to say what it is. I mean, like, you could say it's just a steady state, which is like a very easy definition. Like, say, if your pen's lying on the floor and you don't pick it up, then it's in equilibrium till acted upon by an external force, your hand. Now, you might argue that you could have an equilibrium in like a Keynesian sense where you're in a deep recession, and in a very general sense, it ain't going nowhere. That type of equilibrium, I think, has a bit of sort of sense to ordinary people. But the sort of equilibrium you get in neoclassical economics, which both of you will be studying at some point, and where prices are set to clear supply and demand, it's a unique point. Now, then you've got the problem where it's like, okay, does it exist? Firstly, interesting, maybe not, like you were saying. Secondly, if it does exist, how are we going to get there? Are there forces to bring us there in the market, or will it be like we're all going around the edges, like collapsing, spiraling off into space? That's possibly. Or maybe we are going there, but how long does it take, this so-called traverse? So is it something we're heading to, which we might get to? Or the other point is very interesting. What if the equilibrium moves faster than so there is a theoretical equilibrium, but it's moving away from us faster than we're getting to it. So they're all very interesting ideas, but what have they got to do with the economy? So, I mean, in my point of view, it's a nice idea if you're doing perfect competition. You can draw a little equilibrium diagram, you can talk to the sixth formers or adults learning A level, and it's quite nice. You draw the diagrams, you start with an equilibrium, there's a nudge, you move instantaneously to another, etc. The economist's toolkit. But in reality, how many markets are perfectly competitive? Not very many.
Zero.
Yeah, probably not. Yes. So being very pessimistic.
It's certainly tending at a very fast rate towards zero.
Yeah. How about that? Yeah, I like that cumulative cost. So in a way, is it a concept?
I think it's useful to talk about. I don't like the term equilibrium because now it's kind of been tainted in a way that it's used as a means of justifying a market that is kind of self-adjusting, right? But I like talking maybe about. I like your term of the kind of the distinction between real and theoretical. So I'm going to say I like the idea of a theoretical steady state. It's useful in order to resolve certain directions in which certain factors in the economy are pulling us towards. But it as long as it's understood as theoretical and not as this is what's going to happen, right? So it's useful for understanding the economy. It's not very useful for much else.
I think the more you learn about equilibrium, the more you learn. So you take it with a pinch of salt. Like you said, it's useful. But if you only know a little bit, you think, oh, well, the government's stopping things reaching equilibrium as if it existed, And one thing I think I talked about to you before with regard to like the Austrians, and I don't know all about the Austrian way of thinking, but it's like the thing that there's something they know is theoretically really that it was written about 100 years ago, and they know it's some sort of model or a plausible story, which is a useful benchmark, whatever you want to use. But somehow in 100 years or so, they've somehow converted it to being real. You know, this thing about money arising from barter. Originally, my feeling is most of the Austrian school, or what realised this didn't really happen like that. It was a conjectural history. There's no data in Menger's 18, but some of them have now kind of made it seem as though it is like that. And the is and ought thing that we mentioned before, and that's the problem with equilibrium, that people think there is one and we need to get to it, and the government's stopping us getting there. And that's a dangerous thing, as opposed to what you say, that it's a useful tool in certain contexts. If you know exactly what type of equilibrium you're talking about, and this it gives an encouragement government. You know, if you know you're in an equilibrium, nothing's happening, you're in and so you might argue now, if you look at Rachel Reeves, we're in a sort of equilibrium in a very loose sense, that we're like wobbling along on zero growth, and she's got to do something. So like the pen's lying on the ground in equilibrium, we've got to pick it up and not say, well, the government threw it there and we're just going to have to leave it there and just hope for the best. No, do something.
To give you another analogy, and for those people who like to compare, because a lot of people like to compare economics to other sciences like physics. In engineering, when we are designing structures or designing the size of a column, for example, we'll do all the physics calcs, which are pretty standard, nobody questions, and everybody agrees on, let's say. And then once we estimate the size of the column needs to be to withstand the weight, we add a safety factor, which basically means we leave ourselves a little bit of leeway so that we're not so close to our calculations. In physics, it's something that that we know well. The safety factor can be anything up to 3 or 5 in some situations. So we're saying it's off by 500% our calculation. Because we accept that there is a lot of things that we may not have taken into account.
You're Rumsfelding it. Unknown unknowns.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe the batch of cement isn't as good quality as we assumed it was, or something like that. And but in economics, it's quite funny that in economics, where we are far less certain about the equations that we're using, we are calculating things to the fifth decimal and thinking that that's going to give us an accurate result.
There was a tweet, it was brilliant, and I can't remember the guy's name who did it. He said economists put decimal points in their forecast just to prove they've got a sense of humour. But you're absolutely right. I mean, it's the old thing, better to be roughly right than precisely wrong. I mean, economics is the most precise, and they never get anything anywhere near right. It's like, I mean, not talk too much about schools, but it is quite funny. We were supposed to predict what the students got in their GCSE, so we have to predict how well we think the kid will feel on the day. It's tricky. Will they have been drinking the night before? Will they have been working too hard or too little? What will the paper be like? That's a tricky one when you can't. And also, will they get a lunatic mark in the paper or a normal teacher? So you predict all that. And we did really badly as 1 year at predicting as heads of department. So the boss in charge said that, well, you didn't do very well at predicting an actual grade, like D or C. So what you got to do now is predict more precisely. So you've got to say solid C, could go either way C, or shaky C, and for all the grades. So now instead of having A, B, C, D, and they were the only ones that mattered, you've now got 12 variants. So solid. So it's shown us that because we couldn't even predict the actual thing, we've now got to be more precise. And I think this is happening in economics. They're so bad at getting anything vaguely correct. They've now decided to go for, we think growth will be, like 2.71, when in fact it's not, or it's funny, but it's a bit like, don't you think, crazy?
So to put a button on the markets topic then, absolutely always question whether they're naturally occurring or not, because they're not. The second point is don't say free when you say market, because as Ha-Joon Chang tells us in his 23 Things I Don't Tell You About Capitalism book, point number one is, there is no such thing as a free market. They're all constructs and they have rules. And there's a lot of things that factor into those rules. And therefore, there's a lot of things that factor into market outcomes. And I would say the institutionalist economists have a lot of the answers there. The third thing is that they do not inherently tend towards equilibrium. As Phil said, they can be a good servant, but they need a lot of treatment to become that good servant. Markets endogenously generate instability. So let's move on to point number 8. A lot of people out there, particularly on the internet, will say things like 92% of all money is created by banks. The number will vary. Sometimes it's 95, sometimes it's 97%, but that it's just the banks that create money. Therefore, and these banks are private sector entities, and the government somehow needs to get a load of money from these private sector businesses called banks. Otherwise, it won't have enough money to spend. And this is a very confused way of looking at how money works in a modern economy.
Yes, you could unpack it by saying, okay, first of all, does it really matter? What relevance has it got to anything? And also, what is it really talking about? So, okay, let's have a look at the origin of money, right? Banks issue money in a unit of account, the pound in Britain. Well, where did the unit of account come from? Did the banks, inverted commas, in whatever form, invent the unit of account? The answer, no. It's a confusion, in a sense, between where the origin of stuff comes from and the amount of it produced by particular entities at a later point. So I guess you could argue, okay, say McDonald's produced a burger in wherever McDonald's did it, and then franchised out McDonald's to be produced all over the world. You could then say, oh, well, McDonald's is somehow a global phenomenon that just sprung up automatically. No, it didn't. It might be that most McDonald's are franchised out around the world, but that doesn't mean anything. So, first of all, the state there is no money without a central authority, which we'll call a state. The state names the unit of account. Taxation gives the money value. If the state spends money and there's no taxation, its value will fall eventually to zero because I don't need it anymore. So, that's where the money originates from. Now, the thing is, you can then say, well, in an economy as it develops, you get the development of banking. And this is a very interesting topic. You can look at all types of banking, Roman banks, which didn't create money. They just stored it and lent it. And some people wanted actually the physical money back that they deposited. You would leave your money coins in a bag, and that was the money that you got back. You'd have to pay the banker to keep it. And you didn't want other coins, you wanted those ones. So there's a lot of history of development in banking. Britain has an extremely advanced banking system. Banks create money in large quantities in the unit of account determined by the state. And as Patricia says, the money they create is in the form of bank deposits. So the banks buy our loan note as an asset and create money in the form of deposits. Now, obviously, when the banks make loans, that creates money, and when they are repaid, that destroys money. And you might argue at any point in time, if you wanted to, and I'm not saying it's particularly interesting or relevant, you could say, well, let's have a look at the amount of money in existence. How much of that is if you like, bank deposits that haven't been repaid as loans, and how much of it is reserves. If you regard the banks are just franchise agents of the central bank,
then it's all government money.
and it's all denominated in pounds, the government's unit of account. So going back to my original analogy, it's like saying, I don't know, I can't remember your exact figure, but so many million meals are eaten at McDonald's restaurants controlled by McDonald's, the company, and then twice as much around the world are franchised to whatever companies in those are doing it. Are you still getting a McDonald's? Yes. Does it make any difference? Not really, because money, the stock of money, the flow of money, which people focus on, doesn't really tell you very much. It's like saying, okay, let's have a look about the amount of fuel consumed in an economy. Well, it gives you an idea of how many journeys are being taken, but it's not a causal factor. And you could say, well, if we wanted to stop people driving cars, we could shut down all the petrol pumps. So like the military saying, well, just shut down money and then you can collapse the economy and that'll get rid of inflation. Well, yeah, but it isn't really that. So looking at the quantity of money at any given point in time, does it really tell us very much? No, because, prices are determined in markets and primarily by the government at the absolute level and markets at relative level. And then the money supply expands, to use Christian's term, endogenously. And it doesn't really matter where it comes from. The fact we've got banks creating money to allow the system to function at the existing price level is a good thing, provided, going back to the original point made by Warren and stressed by Rowan, that as long as banks are creating this money to allow things to function to serve public purpose, not just private purpose. And also this 92%.
I think where the number comes from is we know that when the government spends, it creates new reserves. It pays that into the reserve account of a commercial bank and then instructs the commercial bank to create a deposit or mark up the value of somebody's deposit, the recipient of the spending. And I think where the 92-ish number comes from is they look at the pound value of all the reserves in the reserve system and compare it to the pound value of all the money in current accounts in commercial banks and go, well, look, there's way more of this type of money than there is of the government type of money, which means, it's all this kind of fake illegitimate money that's rolling around in banks, and MMT and state and credit theory people don't have anything to say about that because the banks are just doing this willy-nilly. And it's like, no, the government, when it wants to spend, is creating new reserves, and when it taxes, it's deleting reserves. And that's what creates or reduces the deposit of the recipients of the government spending or the person that the government's taking the tax from. I think you need to start there, that the government are putting reserves into the reserve system in order to create an expansion of the number of pounds in current accounts in the current account system, and that there are separate types of money. It's not that the banks have created all the money and the government had to get it from the banks first in order to pay it to other people. The government spending reserves into existence makes new bank credit money come into existence as well. And the only thing that's going to clear a tax payment back to the government is reserves. And then on top of that, let's say you as a private individual want to create money. You can create money and you call it a loan note and you write, I owe you £5,000 to somebody you want to pay it to, and they won't accept it, but you take it to your bank. And your bank will accept it. And your bank will go, yeah, this is money to us. Your promise to pay us money in the future is money to us. We'll take that. We'll give you some of our money. We'll give you £5,000 of our money. We're going to charge you £6,000 ultimately, but you can have £5,000 of our money, and you'll find that clears through the system, and that clears through the system because the government stands behind it and says, look, a pound of this type of money, commercial bank credit, is always going to equal a pound of government money, a pound of central bank reserves. But it doesn't change the fact that the government is the only issuer of the thing that you need to pay taxes. The fact that you use your bank and your bank account to do that doesn't change that fact.
I think that thing about the 92%, sorry to go back to that, is what they're really saying is that money in current accounts at banks and money at deposit accounts at banks counts as money. But from the government's point of view, the reserves held in current accounts at the central bank, that counts. But the ones in savings accounts, bonds, don't. Well, it's only because someone somewhere has decided that broad money includes savings accounts in banks, but doesn't include bonds. So it's just an arbitrary distinction. What does the quantity of it matter anyway? And as you say, paying a tax bill requires a reserve drain, and all you're really doing is using your credit on the bank to tell it to do it. And because the banks are all licensed, that will always happen. But like in principle, if your bank, you had a deposit with your bank and your bank didn't have any reserves and didn't have an overdraft facility, then you couldn't pay your tax with a deposit because there's no reserve drain. And I think people missed that out because it was obvious if you didn't have banks in the middle, the government spends coins and you pay back with coins. Now you've got an intermediary, your agent, the bank, and you've got a credit on the bank, your deposit. You say, look, I'll give you back your own money. And they have to settle that. You know, you pay me £100, I've got a deposit, which is a liability to you. You can have that, but you have to use some of your credit to pay my tax bill, i.e. delete your reserves. And so that's what the bank's function is. So they're confusing like two things, quantity with origins, and also forgetting all the things that you've just said, Christian, about the role of banks as agents between the central bank and its treasury account there and us. A lot of this isn't good faith argument. I think a lot of these guys like to think that banks are the origin of money, even though money massively predates any form of bank. You know, how's it possible?
And that banks issue money on terms set by the state.
Yeah.
I think the short answer is that banks are agents of government when it comes to money creation.
Yes.
They are deputised by the government to deliver, I guess, an elastic money supply.
And can only do so with the support of the central bank.
Absolutely, yeah. We'll be right back after this message from our sponsor. Hey there, dear listener. Our sponsor for this episode of the MMT podcast is you, the listener. And we can't do it without you. And when I say it, I mean our aim to promote the best understanding that we can put together of how this thing called the economy actually works and how we can make it better. And we think a big part of that is knowing that better is possible and that many destructive policy choices are often sold to us by falsely equating the spending capacity of a government to that of a household. The way your government spends is nothing like the way a person or a household spends, because currency issuing governments are the source of their own spending money. Unemployment, underemployment, underfunded public health services, poverty, and many other things that politicians and pundits sell to us as sad but necessary are actually never necessary. Our money system has been mischaracterized in the media and academia for decades. An electorate that knows how it works can truly change things for the better and literally save lives. So we hope you can find it in your heart to support us via patreon.com/MMT podcast, because it really helps keep the show going and we want to make it bigger and better. So thanks as ever for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive back in. So let's move on to number 9 of misleading or unhelpful framings of 2024. This is a long-time contender for the worst thing ever. Labour's fiscal rule. From the website, Labour's website, it says, our fiscal rules are non-negotiable and will apply to every decision taken by a Labour government. This means that the government budget must move into balance. So there's a little bit of that equilibrium there. As long as it's moving into balance, doesn't matter. And then it must move into balance so that day-to-day costs are met by revenues, and then debt must be falling as a share of the economy by the 5th year of the forecast.
So, first of all, forecasts are always wrong. It's given itself a bit of leeway, but what it does do is kind of give out the messaging that fiscal balance is the priority above all else, right? Above people needing food and shelter.
And if you take one thing away from MMT, it should always be that the deficit or surplus, whatever the fiscal position of the government is, it's a residual.
It's the least important part.
But it's the number that falls out of the box. It's a statistic. It's after the fact accounting. It's not an overdraft or a current account that the government has. It's measured after the fact, aiming for it. You can do it. You could say, okay, we want to have less money in the economy for whatever reason because we don't like the number. And then we'll let the circumstances that creates float.
It should never be a target.
But just to get to Stephanie Kelton's point, that you can just go, no, let's fix on a real outcome like full employment and price stability and let the deficit float, because it is at the end of the day after the fact accounting.
It's not the important figure. But there's another part to the rules which I found out afterwards, which were about rules on reducing benefits payments or welfare spending. There's a welfare spending cap, self-imposed welfare spending cap of £134.7 billion for 2024-2025.
I mean, your word of the day, endogenous. Let's go back to that. Now, imagine that we made a target that we had no control over. So all three of us are going to say, tomorrow it's going to be sunny. And it's non-negotiable.
Yeah.
When we wake up and it's raining, what are we going to do about it? And now the problem they've got is that the deficit is endogenous. Like we said, it's not a target. So if, for example, you go into recession, the deficit's going to go up wherever you do. Now, you might think, okay, you can chase your tail a bit like that Osborne did. So he said, okay, we're going into a recession. We've got a deficit because of the automatic stabilizers. So what we're going to do then is cut the discretionary spending, because apparently we're all in it together, and that will offset the fact that there's more being spent on welfare. So then they cut the discretionary spending, but of course when you do that, the recession gets worse and your tax revenues go down. So actually things get worse. So then you can say, well, okay, we're going to keep on cutting discretionary spending, or we might actually reduce the amount in real terms that you're actually giving each individual who's claiming benefits. You could do that. But of course, when you do that, the MPC of benefit claimants is pretty close to 100%. So that's going to make recession worse. So you'll just spiral down like water going down a plug hole because you're trying to chase an endogenous thing. You can't do that. What you really could say is, well, I'm going to dress appropriately for the weather tomorrow. I hope that I can wear a sun hat, but I might need to get an umbrella out. I don't know. So the government doesn't know what the world economic conditions are going to be like. So a legitimate target would be, okay, we're going to ensure full employment, number one, and we're going to have a job guarantee. So that's in the bag. We've got that. We can do it. We're not going to waste resources. So that's number one. Number two, we're going to make sure that the health service is the best health service in the world, and we're going to spend sufficient money on the real resources to make that happen. Now, you'll have to get experts in to actually say what that is. And then you will say, and whatever the deficit is what it is. If we've got inflation from excess government spending, our net spending was too great, then we're very sorry, our planning was wrong, and the following year we'll try to put that right. But that's about it, because the government can't control its own income, and it can't control its own non-discretionary spending. The only thing it can control is discretionary spending, and it should never reduce that in a recession, irrespective of the fact of its size. I mean, the idea is just like insane.
The rule is a promise to act pro-cyclically in a recession.
Yes.
There's not enough spending in the economy because it's a recession. And to solve that, the government is also not going to spend enough.
Yes.
Just making it worse.
Which is back to what we were talking about earlier, the automatic stabilizer. There's only one possible place for that counter-cyclical spending to come from, and that is the currency issue. Your policies should be aimed at stabilization. Again, to go back to another earlier point about the endogeneity of instability within a market system. Your job is to stabilize this system, not pile on and act pro-cyclically and make it worse, which is exactly what the fiscal rule promises. They're going to have to break that rule or have a very chaotic economy.
Well, the start has been pretty poor, hasn't it? So, not trying to. So, out comes the new headmaster. We'll call a joint team, Starmer and Reeves, right? The new Osborne and Cameron. The start being very miserable. Well, it's all bleak, it's all bad, but maybe. Then they're going to raise taxes, particularly the national insurance, which, talk about harebrained schemes, but there we go. So what happens? Well, business, only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Business think, I don't like the sound of this, so investment is low and unemployment starts to rise, growth goes to zero. So now already their plans, they haven't even got going yet. So they've learnt so little. Nothing, in fact. They're just worse than Osborne in a way. Because at least you could argue Osborne and David Cameron hadn't had someone doing exactly what they were doing in recent years. In a way, Starmer and Reeves are worse because they can look back at 2010, not that long ago, and say, well, why are we going to do exactly the same thing again? Blame the previous government, employ austerity, and pretend the end of the world is nigh. And it's like, I'm not saying these recent results are definitive, but it was eminently predictable. You'd be positive. Get some money spent, and also stop kowtowing. I'm getting a bit too political now. Kowtowing to market. When you've given them the power, you've given the bond markets the power, take it back. And don't worry about the foreign exchange markets either. You can control them. It's a market. As I'm going to use Ivan's phrase, markets are an epiphenomenon of the state. We control what happens in Britain as regards foreign exchange markets. We might want to have a massive city so people can do loads of speculation and, make loads of money and drive around in big cars, or we might not. We might want to limit the amount of foreign exchange and other sorts of trades, meaning that a lot of these big bankers will have to leave and go somewhere else. To me, I'm more than happy to go down to Southampton while they're all going onto the boats and wave them off. Bye-bye. And have a much smaller financial sector. And all these guys are quite clever, let's be fair, working. They can all go do something useful. Like maybe work for the health service or be teachers or something.
That's a beautiful vision. And that moves us on to our last point number 10 of our dodgy talking points. This is point number 10. The government is helpless to make change. Mainstream economics seems designed deliberately to tell a story where government policy is bound not by the will of the people, but by the willingness of owners of huge chunks of capital to fund it. And then when the government does do anything, it does it worse than the private sector would do it. So the best thing we can do, just let the government move as far away as possible from the economy. Just let it conduct monetary policy from arm's length. Let market competition weed out all of society's undesirable practices. Guys, is the government helpless? What could we be pushing for in 2025?
Before the election, there was a discussion. I think Andrew Marr was one of the interviewers on the radio. And it was, he wasn't interviewing anybody. He was discussing with somebody else about the prospects for the government. No, it was about the budget, right? Sorry. It was about the budget, and they were discussing about what Rachel Reeves' budget would contain. And there was a big chunk of the discussion which was about how much growth could Rachel Reeves aspire to before the bond markets rein in on her government. And it was a little bit like, well, Rachel Reeves will want to obviously create growth, but not too much, because then she's going to upset the city. And I thought, are we actively discussing, the financial sector dictating to us how much growth we can have? Like, it's not even, we have to ask for permission before we actually become more prosperous by neoliberal standards. And I just thought that was quite indicative of how far we've gone down that route of, well, the government cannot do anything other than ask permission from the bondholders who fund, the whole government endeavor, and therefore the democratic whatever people have voted for is secondary, right, to the preferences of bondholders and those willing to buy government debt. That's all I'm going to say on that. I thought it was just demonstrating how far gone we are down that rabbit hole, and quite sad, really.
Phil, is the government helpless?
Far from it. I mean, I mean, it's Christmas time, and from a Christmas perspective, I would just say, well, second commandment, love your brother as yourself. That's a good viewpoint, isn't it? Let's look after people. So, is the government helpless to make that change, to do something? I'm not saying the government's the only, way of doing it, but it's got a lot of power.
But why do we have governments?
Yeah, that's what it's there for. And that's the first point. So we really need to have that viewpoint. Our objective is care for others, without being, too pushy on that point. For me, it's very important. So then we look, as Patricia said, well, what's actually happening is the capture of, democracy by the city interests, and on a broader scale, very powerful, rich people like Elon Musk and all these guys who are just like using their money to distort things. And I found something actually, what Einstein said, which, you may have heard or your listeners have heard. And he wrote in 1949, and he said, in an inaugural 1949 edition of this magazine, Monthly Review, Einstein argued that private capital, quote, tends to become concentrated in a few hands, resulting in an oligarchy of private capital, the enormous power of which cannot be effectively checked by a democratically organized political society. Moreover, under existing conditions, private capitalists inevitably control, directly or indirectly, the main source of information, press, radio, education. It is thus extremely difficult, and indeed in most cases quite impossible, for the individual citizen to come to objective conclusions and to make intelligent use of his political rights. Now, when you look at that, you think, well, that was 1949. Where are we now? And in a way, the good news is we've got things like this MMT podcast where people can get some other information, that the government has got the power, and the finance sector, who, everyone's kowtowing to, have only got power because we've given it to them. And our decision should really be, are they that valuable? And if we think they are, fair enough, I don't. So we shouldn't be doing what they want. And markets are always under the control of the state. I remember Jeremy Hunt saying nobody can control markets. Of course you can. You might not want to. That's a different question, because you want the big city. You want all the money that flows into London from the city. You might like that. Or you might think, no, we're going to look after our population. We're going to have a job guarantee. We don't need their money. And it's empowering the bad guys. I think you said that earlier, Christian. So we have got the power. We just got to get the message out to people, because they sort of shrug their shoulders and go, well, there's nothing we can do. Poor old Rachel's doing her best. She isn't. And there is another way, and it's a better way.
I'll just cap that off by saying, just remember, the government can always afford to buy anything for sale in the currency it issues, including people who want a job and can't yet find it. otherwise known as unemployed people. Obviously, if you're a central banker, those people are known as inflation fighters, and they're necessary, and we must throw them under the bus. But we say, no, you don't have to do that. We can give everybody a socially inclusive wage, everybody that wants to work. It's not a replacement for disability benefits or sickness benefits. It's just for people who are willing and able to work at a socially inclusive wage. And we talk about this all the time. I'll link to episodes about it. That's affordable for all the reasons we've laid out earlier. So that brings us to the end of the ceremony. And I do thank the panelists for giving us their views. I'll turn to you, Patricia, first. Which one of these talking points should be awarded the Fauxbel Prize? Which of them is the most misleading or unhelpful, in your opinion?
I'm going to go with UK PLC just because of how much I dislike that term. How about you, Phil?
I'm going to go, you might have guessed, I'm going for the fiscal rules. I mean, I don't mind sharing the prize out with you, Patricia. I mean, I don't like but I'd go for number 9, the fiscal rules.
You're the tiebreaker, Christian.
I'm going to split it 3 ways. Taxpayer funded is, I just think it's so subtle and it's utterly unhelpful, and it's utterly the opposite way around to how the government gets its money. Government spends the money into the private sector first, and then we return it, we return it to the government, and it completely turns reality on its head, the taxpayer funded trope.
So there's no clear winner then?
We're going to have to give it 3.
3-way tie.
Yeah, that's right. Sorry, that was what I was looking for. 3-way tie.
They share the prize money of £0.
Yeah.
Maybe we should put it to a vote.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Yeah, how about that?
When this episode airs, do get in touch on Twitter to weigh in with your top economic lie. Before we wrap up, Patricia, I'm just going to ask you about, you launched an MMT activist network. Any news on that?
Well, we just sent the last email of the year. So hopefully everybody who signed up has received the last one. That was just before Christmas, actually. So we do have stuff being prepared for the new year. A lot of kind of ongoing things, trying to get a website completed, trying to create a few videos that this producer, Archie Lachlan, who did the Revolution Anyone movie and interviewed you and me. Christian, do you remember?
Yes, yeah.
So he has kindly offered to lend us his services to do a series of films, MMT related kind of info movies, short info movies. So he will need a lot of help if anybody has any kind of experience with either music composing or GFX or anything video related or graphics, animated graphics. That would be amazing. So just do get in touch with me if you do, or at, I think the email address is admin@mmtuk.org.
Okie doke.
And then I'll pass it on to Archie.
Fantastic. And then Phil, tell us what you've got going on, particularly your new job at Modern Money Lab.
Thanks, Christian. It's a real privilege to, Stephen asked me if I'd help the team and join with Dirk moving to Brussels. So I'm doing the inequality module June through August. So it'll be brilliant to, I know some of the students like yourself, 1 or 2 others, so it should be great fun. And I'm working with Warren currently on the draft is complete for the bio, and it's now ready to see what publishers think. So there'll be some delay, but if anyone's interested in buying it when it comes out, I'm hoping to keep it under £30 as a paperback. It won't be one of those ridiculous ones.
That's a great place to leave it. We've been speaking with Phil Armstrong, and I'll link to where you can stay current with Phil in our show notes. I'll also link to details of Patricia's MMT Activist Network. If you want to take your understanding of MMT and real-world economics to the next level, I'll link to where you can find out more about Modern Money Lab's groundbreaking online graduate and postgraduate courses. I'm a student there. I love it. The courses are delivered by the best lecturers in the world in their respective fields, many of whom regular listeners will be familiar with from this show, including the fantastic Dr. Phil Armstrong. And Modern Money Lab's term starts again in mid-February, and Phil joins in the summer. Finally, as ever, for our Patreon subscribers, there'll be a link to all of our patron-only episodes in the show notes. Lots of extras there for you to unlock. But for now, thanks so much for joining us today on the MMT podcast, Dr. Phil Armstrong.
Brilliant as always, Christian and Patricia.
That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month and get access to patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino, and you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you.